Welcome back to this Theology Matters course called The Gospels in Comparison. In the first session, we began to look at what it means that we have the life and teachings of Jesus, not in a single continuous narrative, but rather in a fourfold account. Four unique, related, but still unique and non-identical stories about Jesus' life. One of the tendencies in the church today, but also in the past, has been to take those four Gospels and to harmonize them into one unified story. And there are many advantages of doing that. But in this particular course, one of our interests is to say, what if we didn't harmonize the Gospels? And what if we listened in to the distinctive voices of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? What would we learn? What new insights or theologies might we be able to engage by thinking in this slightly different way? This particular lesson, which is lesson 2 in this 7-part series, I'm calling Gospel 101. In a sense, what we're going to do is we're going to look at 7 key topics, very briefly, that I think are essential to understanding the Gospels in the first place. We're not going to be kind of going through an outline of what happens in the Gospels, but I want to deal with 7 key issues that I think are very important to understanding how the Gospels work and what, in fact, we're reading when we sit down and read a gospel. So we'll go through these 7 in order. Why 7, you ask? Well, 7 is a nice symbolic number of wholeness. That could be the answer. Or it could just be that I only knew 7 things about the gospel. And so these are the 7 things I know about the gospel. And so these are the 7 things I'll talk about. So first is an issue of terminology. Now, for those who like grammar, who maybe were English majors or teachers of the like, I'm going to ask what seems to be a grammatical question at first, but then I'm going to bend it towards theology. Do we use a lowercase g or an uppercase g when we write the word gospel? What do y'all think? Lowercase g, uppercase g? Okay, it depends. Okay, I'm prepared for the depends answer. Okay, so let me give you 2 examples. Gospel of Jesus Christ, Gospel of Mark. What do you use in these 2 specific it depends cases? What about for Gospel of Jesus Christ? Lower or upper? Lower. What about for Gospel of Mark? Lower or upper? Upper. Very good. This what you answered coheres very nicely with the Chicago Manual of Style, which is my Bible in terms of grammar and writing and editing. And the Chicago Manual of Styles, in fact, says that you typically use uppercase G, but in reference to a particular work. So uppercase G, Gospel of Matthew, uppercase G, Gospel of John, so on and so forth. When it's not a specific gospel, but it refers just kind of generally to this idea of good news, so the good news, that's what gospel means of Jesus Christ, then you can use lowercase. Well, okay, we've got all of our grammar tied up, but I actually think there's an interesting theological point here that I want to tease out. And part of the reason that there's an interesting theological point is that in the New Testament, all of this goes back, gospel, good news, all the same thing, goes back to one word, euangelion. But interestingly, in the New Testament, that word is used in 2 different ways. And I think it warrants different grammar. And I just want to name what those 2 things are. The first use, and this is most common in the Pauline corpus, so the letters that Paul writes to various churches, the word euangelion occurs over 60 times. And in every single case where Paul used the words euangelion, he's not talking about writing. He's not talking about a book, let alone a fourfold collection of stories about Jesus. When Paul uses the word euangelion, he's talking about speech. He's talking about an oral account of the story of what Jesus has done. We actually see this very clearly in 1 Corinthians 15:1. This is Paul speaking. Now I would remind you, brothers and sisters, of the good news. That's that word euangelion or gospel. I want to remind you of the good news that I proclaim to you. He's talking about something he told them, something oral, speech, which you in turn received, in which you also stand. Paul here is not talking about the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew. Why do I know that? Because in all likelihood, the Gospels were written after the time of Paul. Paul does his ministry without a gospel book, let alone even a single version of the gospel. So for Paul, euangelion means good news, but it means good news narrated through speech in an oral tradition. So that's not our gospels that we're talking about in the course. Our gospels are related to that gospel, but that's the gospel of Jesus Christ, the lower G gospel. Now, interestingly enough, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, tend to follow Paul in that use of euangelion as speech. Believe it or not, in none of the four Gospels, none of the four authors of the Gospels refer to their own writing as gospel. So catch that. The very things that we call Gospels never refer to themselves as Gospels. The one exception to that might be in the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. Mark says the beginning of the good news, euangelion, gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, he might be talking about the beginning of his gospel, that is capital G, but he also could just say this is the beginning of the story, the oral tradition that I know of Jesus Christ. But in none of the other gospels is this done. John and Matthew only self-identify as books, biblion. Luke describes his account as a diegesis, that is, as a narrative. But they never call themselves gospels. So where do we get this idea that our gospels are gospels, right? Well, it doesn't actually happen until the mid-2nd century CE. So about 100, 150 years pass by. And Justin Martyr, who we mentioned in the first session, he, in a letter, begins to describe what was then known as memoirs of the apostles. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in the 2nd century, were known as memoirs of the apostles. He, for the first time, that we know of at least, refers to those memoirs of the apostles as euangelia, as gospels. And it's from the time of Justin then that it sticks, that these things that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote are capital G gospels. But long before that, this written account of the gospels was not known. Again, we must remember that the first written gospel doesn't even come on the scene until probably the 60s, and maybe even a tiny bit later. So there was at least a full generation of followers of Jesus who didn't have any written account, at least not as we know them today. And then for practical reasons, as we talked about last sessions, many churches didn't have these written accounts for quite a bit of time. So that's the first point, is one of terminology. Make sense so far? Little g, upper G? I hope our English teachers in the room are satisfied with that description. Okay, so that's terminology. Let me move, and all of these topics, let me say, there's more to be said. I want to give you a taste of these 7 things. The second key thing I think we need to just talk about is authorship. Who wrote the Gospels? Well, what would be the very kind of logical answer? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? Well, just as a side note, because you all are doing very well with this, very, very good job. In a recent Pew survey of religious knowledge in America, less than 45% of people who identify as Christian could name the 4 Gospels. So if you entered into this room being aware that there were 4 Gospels and could get at least a couple of those names, you are definitely on the right side of the curve. So that is good. Historically, these names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have been associated with authorship. But again, I want to dig a little bit deeper here. On the one hand, in none of the Gospels is an author named. So if you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, none of them say, hey, I'm Mark, I'm writing this gospel. Or there's not some like nice foreword where Mark dedicates the gospel to his mom, or so that John doesn't sign the end of his gospel. So the gospels themselves don't tell us who wrote the gospels. Now, in fairness, we do have very ancient manuscripts. This is not an ancient manuscript, but it's a copy of the Greek New Testament, that at the very beginning of the Gospels, we have these little headings. And I know most of you probably can't read Greek. I don't know if I can read Greek, to be honest. But I know that this reads kata markan. Kata means according to. So there are these little superscriptions in the Greek manuscripts that say according to Mark, according to Matthew, according to Luke, according to John. These are found on really ancient manuscripts, but we must remember that they weren't original to the gospel writings themselves. When Mark first wrote his gospel, he didn't write katamarkon at the top. This is what the church does later, once already these associations with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are set. So they're early. In fact, they probably come from sometime in the late 2nd century CE, from the writings of Irenaeus, another prominent thinker in the early church. It's from him that we get the tradition that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the 4 Gospels. But why? Why did Irenaeus say that these 4 were the gospel writers? Well, we don't know for sure, but we do know that the early church thought it was important to connect each gospel to an apostle, right? They wanted the link between the gospels and Jesus to be as close as possible, and the way to do that is you say, well, the gospel writers were the apostles themselves. And here's kind of how that works. With Matthew and John, it's easy, because we can assume that John is the beloved disciple, that disciple referred to, the apostle referred to as the beloved disciple in John. It's a little ambiguous about who he is, but he's probably one of the sons of Zebedee. And so, okay, that gets the Gospel of John really close to Jesus. Matthew, in Matthew's Gospel, a tax collector who comes and follows Jesus is called Matthew. He's called something else in another Gospel, but we'll leave that to another matter later. And so, okay, we got 2 apostles at least. That's great. Another Bible trivia moment. That's Matthew and John. Are there any apostles or any of the 12 disciples named Mark and Luke? No. So we've got a problem here, right? If we want the gospel writers as close to Jesus as possible, those know Mark and Luke, so why Mark and Luke? Well, here's how Irenaeus reasoned, or here's how we think they reasoned. I call it apostleship by association. So Mark and Luke were not one of the 12 apostles. Mark, though, was thought to be connected to Peter. Why? Because in 1 Peter 5:13, as Peter writes, he sends greetings to someone named Mark. So there's some connection between Peter and Mark. Now, Mark's also one of the most common names in the Greco-Roman world, so whether it's the Mark who wrote the gospel or not, we don't know. But in history and tradition, there's this connection between Peter and Mark. What about Luke? Well, it's also apostleship by association. Luke is identified as a companion of Paul in 1 Corinthians 4:14. Paul mentions Luke, the beloved physician. And in other places in Paul's letters, he does refer to a we sometimes. And so it's thought that maybe he had this travel companion, a doctor who moved around with him, and that doctor was named Luke. So at least Mark and Luke, they're connected secondhand to someone who was really with Jesus. Now, that's the tradition. Did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John really write these Gospels? There simply and honestly is no way of affirming or disconfirming that that's the case. But we must keep a couple things in mind in terms of these associations. For instance, as I said before, take the identification of Mark and his connection to Peter. Mark is one of the most common names in the Roman Empire. And moreover, in the New Testament, Mark is actually more commonly associated with Paul than he is with Peter. So it's not so clear that if you wanted to get someone connected, if you wanted to get Mark connected to someone, it would be through Peter. And there's other problems with Luke and Matthew as well. The simple thing I want to say is I'm not entirely sure that it matters. I don't think we get a lot as interpreters, as faithful people who want to gauge these scriptures by being able to identify the author in each of these situations. Take, for instance, the description of Luke as a physician. With all due respect to physicians in the room, Luke's vocabulary is not particularly doctoral. In other words, there's a great paper that describes Luke as basically a horse physician. I mean, the language he uses that could be understood as doctorally or medical is really nothing more than any common person would have in the ancient world, or a veterinarian would have. So there's nothing that, knowing that Luke wrote the gospel and he was a physician, it doesn't really get us very far in our interpretation. But we do recognize that historically these associations have been made, and so we continue to refer to them as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, so that's authorship. The third point to keep in mind is the question only 4. We have 4 gospels in our New Testament, but are there only 4 gospels out there? What do you think? No, there's actually a lot of other gospels out there. None of the gospels, none of the writings in the New Testament claim to be exhaustive. In fact, we have this line from John 20:30 that says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book." And we might add, and aren't written in Mark or Matthew or Luke either. Even if we take all 4 gospels collectively, that's not an exhaustive story about everything Jesus did and said. Certainly he would have done much more. And maybe those other things that he did that don't fall in our 4 gospels, maybe they survived in oral traditions. Maybe people told stories about other parables that Jesus shared around the dinner table, around the campfire. Maybe there were even other writings that preserved traditions of Jesus. It's very plausible that this is the case. And in fact, from an archaeological perspective, we have examples of many other gospels that didn't make it into the New Testament canon. There's 4 complete gospels, the Proto-Evangelion of James, and a couple of others. There's fragments of 8 additional non-canonical gospels, and there are references in other writings to 16 more accounts that are called gospels, or that attempt to describe something about Jesus' life and death. Now, in a lot of these cases, there's a lot of similarities between these non-canonical gospels and our gospels in the New Testament. Oftentimes, they expand the story. So the nativity story is a famous story to expand. Some of them just give a much fuller account of how the birth of Jesus happened, or where it happened, or when it happened, or one gives a full account of who Mary's parents were and how Mary was born. It was kind of like the prequel. You know, in Star Wars, there's prequels. Well, some of them are like prequels to our 4 gospel accounts, and they kind of tell us the backstory of what gets us there. Now, we tend to not take these seriously, and at one level that makes sense. They're not, after all, in our canon, in our Bible. We don't have sermons on them. And that makes sense, but I want to have a little, my pushback against that. My point isn't that we should start reading the non-canonical Gospels in church services on Sunday, but I do want to say 2 things. One, I think it's very plausible that other writings that aren't in our Bible preserved real things that Jesus said and did. There's no reason to think that our Gospels contain everything Jesus did. In fact, we know that they didn't. So that's not implausible to me. The second thing that's interesting is that when you, from archaeological discoveries, particularly from one place called Nag Hammadi from Egypt, from about the 2nd century to the 7th century, we actually find fragments of these non-canonical gospels mixed in with fragments of canonical gospels. What that suggests is that there were ancient churches who kept both Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John around, and the Gospel of Mary, and the Gospel of Thomas, and the Gospel of Nicodemus, all these other things that even though they weren't canonical, even though the church had more or less decided on that, there were churches that said, yeah, but it's still helpful to read this stuff. It might not be canonical, but this is still about our Jesus. This is still about our Savior. So, again, I'm not certain that I'm making a plea for us to do the same, but it's important to note historically that there wasn't this sharp design. Canon, non-canon. You have true gospels, not true gospels. There was a little bit more of a fuzzy line between the 2 of them. You guys with me so far? I know I'm going quickly on some of this, but any questions, concerns, protestations, tearful denunciations, anything? Yes?
And the reason we don't go into the non-canonical gospels is because it's hard enough for us to do the gospels properly.
Yeah, so my recommendation would be, if you can master the 4 canonical gospels, I would love to do a study with you on the Gospel of Thomas. But master the 4 canonical Gospels first, because I think that's what the church has uplifted as kind of the central testimony about. I have not mastered the 4 canonical Gospels, as will become evident in this course. So let me quickly move on to a couple other matters. What about genre? What are we reading when we read the Gospels? Yes, I know we're reading a Gospel, but in terms of like the style of literature, what is this? Here I'm going to do a very, very super quick microwave version of a TAPS exercise. Actually, we might even just do this as a group. Which of the following genre labels do you think best applies to the canonical gospel? So I'm going to give you 4 here. So eyewitness account, biography, hero's journey, or sermon. If you had to pick one, what do you think best describes what we're reading when we read the Gospels? And why?
Hero's journey.
Hero's journey. Why?
Just because it tells all the highlights of Christ's activities.
Yeah.
During his service.
But Mark was probably the closest thing to an eyewitness account.
Okay, so maybe a little bit of eyewitness, right? Hero's journey. There's actually modern studies that talk about the Jesus story as like fitting the very like paradigmatic parts of a hero's journey. What any others?
And biography.
Biography.
Yeah. It's not necessarily an eyewitness.
Yeah.
Usually what the writer's not, so it's a biography.
Right. So it's still about a famous person, but it's not all biographies are eyewitnesses. In fact, most biographies aren't eyewitnesses. Yeah, so good. Anyone on a sermon?
Yeah, I've always thought it was advocacy pieces.
Advocacy, yeah.
Answering the question, who is this Jesus?
Yeah.
But from it, in a convincing kind of way.
Right, because it's not like a straightforward history, right? They're telling a story for a very specific reason and to persuade, right? Or to sermonize or theologize. I'm now making up words. So it's told for a very particular purpose. And it's not just to recount how things were. I think there's a truth in all of these. I think you could make a case that there are elements of all of these that could describe what we're reading in the canonical Gospels. Here's how I'm going to put it, though, for the purpose of this class. I think that ancient biography is probably the closest. It doesn't rule out the others, but I think it's probably the closest, in part because we actually have other ancient biographies from the time of Jesus that we can compare to, right? So there are other biographies of other famous people, so we can say, well, what elements do they have? What elements do the Gospels have? And we can compare. And they actually share on a lot of things together. They focus on one main character. They're prose narrative. They're relatively short. All of these ancient biographies are between 10,000 and 20,000 words, which is actually fairly short for a whole account of someone's life. The Gospels fall exactly in that range. Mark is just over 11,000. He's the shortest. Luke is the longest. He's just over 19. So they even, like in length, they fit exactly what you would expect from an ancient biography. There's my length one. They give significant attention to ancestry, birth, great deeds, virtues, geographical settings, and death. All of that is exactly true of the Gospels as well. But I think the Gospels are ancient biography, but with a couple of twists. There's a couple notable points where our Gospels are different than ancient biographies. They're not about an elite individual. Almost all of the biographies in the ancient world are about elite individuals. Now, I know Jesus becomes very important and famous, but he wasn't when he lived. We must remember that Jesus was not a literate, middle-class white man living in the Middle East. He was a poor, likely illiterate, almost certainly homeless man of very little fame and reputation. That was the Jesus of his time. Now, again, I know we understand his role in our lives and history quite differently now, but that's who he would have been seen as. So it's remarkable that even a story would have been written about him. Second, all of the biographies feature some sort of noble death, courageous death that is very fitting to a man who's lived a great life. That's not the crucifixion. Crucifixion was a horrific and disgraceful death. Now, of course, we have the resurrection, and that's kind of the next point, that all of these biographies end with the death scene. And, of course, that's not true of our Gospels. There's another chapter to be told in our Gospels of Jesus. So it's biography, but it's biography with a twist. That's point 4. Now, I'm going to just say very little about this for sake of time. When were they written? The simple answer here is we don't exactly know. In tradition, we assumed that their canonical order reflects their historical order. That is, Matthew wrote first, then Mark wrote, then Luke wrote, then John wrote. The problem with this is that there are actually, believe it or not, this order, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that we all know, wasn't set. There are actually other lists in the early church. For instance, there's a Matthew, John, Luke, Mark canonical order that we find evidence of. So it's not so certain that that canonical order equals history because the canon and its order has changed over time. The other reason is that for reasons that we'll talk about later, there's good reason to suspect that Mark was the first gospel to be written. I'll unpack that further in both 5 minutes from now and then in the next session, in session 3. I'll say more about why that is. But I'll just suffice to say for now that in kind of modern scholarship, Mark is widely considered to be the first. It's the simplest, it's the shortest. We'll see again kind of why this is. Mark probably writes in the late 60s, maybe into the 70s. Matthew and Luke follow about 10 years later, probably. And then while it's hard to place John on an exact year, it's almost certain that John is the last, that his is kind of like the most retrospective of all of the different gospel accounts. Okay, two more to go. This one, again, we'll do quickly. It's about grouping. I didn't know how to say this exactly. But when we look at all the Gospels, right, we notice distinctions and similarities between all of them, but they're not all equally the same and equally different. In fact, when you look at all four of the Gospels, three of them tend to be more alike, and one of them tends to be a little bit more out in right field, or just doing a different thing. Does anyone know who's the gospel that's a little more out there, or just doing something different? John. So you all know this, right? So Matthew, Mark, Luke are different. They're important differences, but they are very, very similar. In fact, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are more alike one another, and the difference between them, or the distance between any one of them, is small in comparison between the difference between Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John. So sometimes you'll hear the word synoptic, or synoptic gospels, as a reference to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Synoptics means literally just seeing with or seeing together. Matthew, Mark, and Luke kind of offer us a similar vision of Jesus. Whereas John's gospel, while not incompatible in any way with the others, has a very unique view. John just says a lot of stuff that the other gospels don't say. And so for that reason, because John is so distinct, I think actually John warrants a course on its own. And so for our purposes, as we do the comparison, we are mostly, not exclusively, but we are mostly going to focus on Matthew in comparison to Mark, in comparison to Luke. We're going to look more at the synoptics, with occasional look back at John. But I just wanted to signal that they're not all equally different or alike. This then brings us to the final slide, and this will set us up for the rest of the course. But it's also probably the most complicated issue that we'll deal with. And I'm going to do my best to simplify a complex idea into a couple easy footholds for you to understand. The final question is about the relationship particularly between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If they are so closely related, as we have said, can we draw any conclusions about why they're so closely related? That is, can we draw any conclusions about their literary relationship? Is someone copying off of someone else? Does Mark know Matthew, or does Luke know Matthew, and he copies over large parts of the text? What's kind of the relationship that can explain why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are both very similar in some points and also very different at other points? And so I want to break this down into two things. I want to give you three kind of facts, three observations about their similarity, and then I'm going to offer an explanation for it. So three things. What's the data about their similarity? First, it's about language. Now catch this. In a number of places, Matthew, Mark, and Luke not only have similar stories, so that would be plausible. So they all have a story about Jesus' baptism or something like that. That would just imply that they all know the same sort of thing. But what's interesting is that when Matthew, Mark, and Luke have the same story, in a lot of times, they have the exact same wording. Now, this is not always evident in the English, but it is very clear in the Greek that they use the same words to say, in the same order, to say the same thing. So if I grabbed any three of you in this audience and showed you like a 10-second video clip and I said, hey, describe it, you would all describe something similar, right? But you probably would describe it in slightly different ways, but it would be unusual for you to say the same thing with the same words in the same order. In fact, if you did, what would I be suspicious of? Collusion, that you actually kind of talk together. So this is an interesting observation, that it's not just similarity, but it's identity. And further, when Matthew, Mark, and, well, let me just leave it at that. Again, I'm going to try to simplify here. Here's our second observation. It's about material. Okay, 90% of the Gospel of Mark appears in both Matthew and Luke. So 9 out of 10 things Mark says, it's there in Matthew and it's there in Luke. 10% of what Mark says is in neither Matthew nor Luke. So you catch that? Matthew never has something from Luke Matthew never has something from Mark unless Luke does also. And Matthew never excludes something from Mark unless Luke excludes also. So there's an interesting pattern here. You see what's happening? Another fact. Matthew and Luke, not Muke, but Matthew and Luke share certain content that's not in Mark. So Matthew and Luke share content because they both have Mark stories, but they also, the stuff that's not in Mark, they also share, and it's all about Jesus sayings, like the Sermon on the Mount and things like that. They're not in Matthew, but they're not in Mark. I'm getting all my names mixed up, which is certainly no help to you, but they share them together. Are you with me? Well, let me do one other piece, and it's about sequence. Imagine the story of Mark as a series of events, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, so on and so forth. From the baptism of Jesus to the empty tomb, that sequence is the same in Matthew and in Luke. Okay? So they might tell the story in different ways, but they follow the same order. This happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and this happens. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all agree. Prior to the baptism of Jesus, Matthew doesn't follow Mark, and Luke doesn't follow Mark, and Matthew and Luke are different. So when they differ, when Matthew and Luke differs from Mark, they differ from one another. The same thing is true after the empty tomb. Matthew and Luke do not follow Mark, but they're also different from one another. Okay. So this is a dizzying array of observations. Can we make sense of it? In fact, if you kind of slow down here, and if we had a longer, we could actually do this together. If you slow down, there's actually only one way to explain all of this, right? You could explain in multiple ways if stories were just similar. But the fact that you have this pattern of identity and difference can only really be explained in one way. And here it is. It's basically a two-source hypothesis. Here's how it works. Mark, he's a source. Matthew and Luke both grab stuff from Mark. So clearly Matthew and Luke know Mark. And Matthew takes some from Mark, Luke takes some from Mark. But that doesn't explain the whole story. Because remember, Matthew and Luke share certain material that's not in Luke. This is really confusing when I keep messing up the names. This is unbelievable. Sorry, this is a disaster. Remember that Matthew and, I'll start saying things like Rick, Matthew and Luke share things that are not in Mark. So there must be another source. How else would Matthew and Luke share things? Well, they had a second source. Scholars have called that Q. Q is just from a German word, Quelle, which means source or writing or the like. And so Matthew and Luke draw on Mark for some stuff. They draw on Q for some stuff. Q is just a hypothetical collection of sayings that Jesus has. Then finally, there's some stuff that's unique to Matthew. Whether he had a source or not, we don't know. And there's some stuff that's unique to Luke. Whether he had a source, we don't know. This is the only way to explain the pattern of identity and difference between these gospel writers. And this is also what leads scholars to think, Mark probably wrote first. How else would Matthew and Luke be able to draw on him had he not written first? And we don't actually have a copy of Q that we can look at. It might not have even been a written document. It could have just been an oral tradition that Matthew and Luke both knew really well and thought, gosh, we need to include this stuff in our gospel. So it's a complex relationship, and there won't be a test on this, but because this gets talked about a lot, I wanted to just signal it as part of our understanding of the Gospels. This brings us then to the conclusion of our Gospel 101. What we'll begin to do next session is to turn to the first Gospel, to the Gospel of Mark, asking what are the distinctive features of Mark, and more importantly, what do those distinctive features tell us about Mark's theology and about the context in which he was writing in. And as we do that, we'll be able to look at, because you might be wondering at this point, where is my refund? We have not looked at much Bible yet. I understand this. And your refund for this free course is forthcoming. But I promise we will actually look at a lot of Bible in future weeks, because I'm going to start saying, here, check this out. What can you tell about Mark based on this, based on what you see here on the screen? And we'll look at a lot of different things, but we're going to tend to focus on the beginning of the story. So you can kind of think, okay, we talked about the beginning of Mark, we talked about the beginning of Matthew, beginning of Luke, and so forth. So you're beginning to put this together. Then, as I said, in our final two sessions, we'll do some case studies where we look at things like the Transfiguration, the baptism of Jesus, stories that tend to be repeated across Gospels, but not repeated in the same way. And that's where things will get really fun, as we begin to put these pieces of a complex puzzle together. I hope you join us for our next session. Thank you.